Hey, everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and I have a question for you. Do you remember from your high school or college world history class, do you remember talking about the Emperor Caligula? He's kind of a little-known guy who crops up, I think it's 37 to 41 AD. I was tempted to sandbag and be like, I don't remember, but I'm pretty sure those are the dates that he was actually there, 37 to 41. If not, I don't mind looking like an idiot in front of you. So it's very short-lived. Like, he was in there for the length of one presidential term in terms of at least my country at any rate. And he was nuts. He just did crazy stuff. He's the guy who took the whole role of emperor off the cliff, over the shark, into Crazyville. He has all of these elaborate exploits, but the history around him it's also kind of murky. A lot of those first century Roman historians, I think Dio Cassius talks about him a whole bunch, and then the big name guys as well. When he comes up, it's always this like, he boasted this, he said that, people said this about him, but there's not really a lot of direct attestation about him. It's almost more myth than man when it comes to the madness of Caligula. Well, one of the things that this dude did as a grand narcissist was that he was obsessed with Alexander the Great and his exploits. Alexander the Great, you remember this guy. He was this Greek, well, really Macedonian conqueror who had a great run starting when he was 18 years old after being tutored personally by Aristotle. He goes and conquers the whole known world, topples empires, and then he dies at a young age in 323 BC. But this guy rewrote everything about language and culture and civilization. And so understandably, every major world leader, especially Roman ones who come after him, are like, I kind of got to live up to Alexander. How do I compare to his reputation? And so any point of connection that these guys could come up with Alexander, they would want to come up with. And in particular, Caligula, who was I think his dad's name was Germanicus, who was like a godson to the emperor Tiberius. Tiberius was in charge when Jesus was crucified. And so Germanicus works some things around, gets Caligula into power, and somewhere along the way, either Germanicus or Caligula gets their mitts on the breastplate, the golden armor of Alexander the Great, as seen being worn by Colin Farrell in that movie from a few years ago. That was a really fancy decorative breastplate. It wasn't really meant for war. It was the ceremonial one. And Alexander, he died in Babylon. He had been moved to Alexandria. There's his name on it. You see why the guy would be buried there. Eventually, somebody melted down the coffin during the Ptolemy era there. One of the Ptolemid leaders did that because things were getting tight, and they replaced that coffin with a crystal coffin. But literally, Alexander's embalmed but yet rotting body is just in there for people to look at from time to time to pay respects when they come through Alexandria. Well, Germanicus or Caligula, they're like, yeah, we want that armor, though. And so they get it using royal imperial power. They get this thing. And then Caligula has this bizarre fascination, apparently, and this may be apocryphal, people debate it. He has this bizarre fascination with something that a Roman soothsayer or poet, I don't remember which, had said, mocking him. He's like, you know what? It is about as likely that Caligula is going to turn out to be the emperor of Rome as it is that he's going to ride his horse to that island out there in the Bay of Naples. And so Caligula was like, yeah, I need to make a mental note to stick it to that guy later on. So eventually, Caligula gets Alexander's armor, puts it on, spends a bunch of imperial money from the imperial treasury to build a floating bridge that goes out to this island. Then he makes all the oligarchy, the fancy people, the rich people, the nobility, makes them all come out and watch and pay homage and celebrate as he rides his horse in this grand procession out to this island as this grand conqueror, even though he never really conquered anything at all. I think his nickname was Baby Boots. And he does all of this while wearing the armor of Alexander. The point being that in Caligula's brain, the way that you demonstrate to people that you kick butt and are worthy of being honored is to have a very fancy procession into a place with everybody watching and everything screaming, look at me. But he's a clown king, much like the motif of clown king throughout the Bible. Every time we run into one of these rulers, they're presented in the text as being very Caligula-like, silly, drunk with their own power, imagining that they are the sun and the moon and the stars, and that they are the reflection of the deity and a deity themselves, and that they're worthy of worship and adoration like a god, that statues should be erected to them, but they're always easily manipulated fools, much like Xerxes in the book of Esther. Well, by the time we get to the events of Matthew chapter 21 and Jesus finally arriving in Jerusalem, coming up through the otherwise unknown city of Bethphage on the east side of Jerusalem, up from Jericho and onto the Mount of Olives where he can look down and see the whole place. As we get to this moment, the original audience would no doubt be thinking something that you and I aren't thinking. And that is, well, how's he going to come into town? He's a king. He's a conqueror. What's it going to look like? You and I don't think about that. A grand entrance, whatever. Maybe pop stars, rock stars do that kind of nonsense. But this wouldn't be the question we would ask. But man, the original audience, like, is this going to be Jesus' debut, his coming out party, his mic drop moment? Or is this going to look different? What does the kind of king Jesus is look like in this triumphal environment? And all of that original audience would have had in their heads some of these ridiculous stories, whether they were legendary and apocryphal or whether they actually happened. They still would have known the story. The original audience would have known the story of Caligula as they are reading this. Now, the Caligula thing hadn't happened quite yet as the Jesus thing is occurring, but by the time Matthew's written, like, they all know that's the deal. Maybe that story was so hot and so in the news and so popular that what I'm about to read to you from this passage was something that Matthew even had in mind, and he was using key buzzword language that we might not recognize now, but that they all would have caught in the original audience, to point out how different Jesus is than the other conquerors like Alexander, like Pompey, like Julius Caesar, like the clown pretender Caligula. So what will Jesus' entrance into the holy city, his debut as king, look like? Well, here we go. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you'll find a donkey tied there with her colt by her. Untie him and bring him here to me. And if anybody says anything to you, tell them that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. "Say to the daughter of Zion, see, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, on the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them, and Jesus sat on them. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And then the crowds went ahead of him, and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest!" When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowds answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." Oh my goodness, there are 8 jillion things that we need to talk about here, and boy, oh boy, my friends, are we going to, one little bit at a time over the next several days. But for today's purposes, all I want you to notice is the contrast between all of the stories about how all of the conquering world system kings had rolled into places and what that would have meant, and how they were trying to puff themselves up and look impressive, how Caligula wasted a bunch of money to build a floating bridge and strapped on Alexander's breastplate, or one that he tried to pass off as being Alexander's. He was probably lying. Everything about it is pomp and circumstance and boasting and bloat and rot and fake and whitewashing. And then Jesus shows up with a truer, realer kingdom that will never go away and never fade and never expire. The most powerful king of all the kings, the most powerful being of all the beings, God in the flesh, the Christ, the Messiah. He should get 5 sets of Alexander's armor. He should get a floating bridge that goes 5 times further than stupid Caligula's floating bridge. He should get some kind of special hat that he wears so everybody knows that he's the guy who has the special hat with the jewels in it and the gold, and he just doesn't do any of that stuff. None of it. It's an upside-down kingdom. And so he goes with the values of the kingdom, because you know how much those things I just said have currency based on what we've learned about the kingdom Jesus is describing? None. They have none. They don't matter. You can't buy anything in the kingdom with that stuff. It doesn't count for anything. If anything, it's the kind of stuff you got to get rid of before you can enter the kingdom, according to just 2 chapters earlier in Matthew 19. And so he shows up in a way that is in keeping with who he said he was all along. And in this moment, I wonder if some of the guys who are with him, some of the people who aren't named, who were following along, I wonder if the 2 blind guys who he picked up as part of his retinue after healing them in Jericho, I wonder if anybody quietly along the way was like, I hope this guy turns out to be real, but I bet he's a fraud. Like, you cannot roll into Jerusalem, of all places, with an entourage like this and stay who you were. That is going to go away like the morning dew when the heat comes out as soon as you make it into Jerusalem, because nobody can be this real. And then he gets there, and instead of getting some giant war horse, some stallion, instead of having somebody run ahead of him as his herald shouting all of his titles like Daenerys Targaryen conquering this thing or that thing, instead he sits sideways on a donkey. Now, everybody else sees him, at least in part, for who he is, and they're the ones celebrating. They're the ones saying the stuff, but it's not him. And I wonder if in that moment, the people who had lingering doubts about what it would be like when this guy got around the ring of power, would the lust for it overtake him like it overtook everybody else? I wonder if their questions were answered. We got a hint that this is how Jesus would respond to the temptation of power and glory and normal king things in Matthew chapter 4, when we see how he conducted himself under the temptation and duress of the devil, and we see him pass that test that nobody else could ever pass. We see him pass the test of Boromir picking up the ring in the snow and being like, oh, we could use this power against our enemies. Everybody else failed the test. Jesus passed it in the wilderness. Now Jesus passes it when the pressure is on and everybody's watching. And this is the weirdest regal entry into a city that we've ever seen in history and have ever seen since. And we have got a ton to talk about in terms of what it means and why. Can't wait to do it. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.